founder and co-artistic director of Monuments to Movements. So Neysa is a curator, lecturer, writer, and educator. Prior to moving to Kansas City, she was the executive director of the Department of Exhibitions and Performance Spaces at Columbia College, Chicago. She's produced over 300 exhibitions and public art projects. Some of these, just to name a few, are Inequality in Bronze, Monumental Plantation Legacies, some international mural exchanges in Casablanca and Toronto, Vacancy, Urban Interruption and Regeneration with the Chicago Architectural Biennial, and Not Ready to Make Nice, Guerrilla Girls in the Art World and Beyond, among many other projects. So recently she launched a mural and monument project to Illinois women's suffrage. So upon hearing about Neysa's project, I immediately thought it might align with some of the concepts in the exhibition downstairs. I really admire the ambitious scope of Neysa's work, and it challenges antiquated tradition and reimagines a more democratic vision of a monument. So with this exhibition coming to the close, I wanted to think through how to acknowledge the past and also move forward into the present. And this end-to-end model of intersectional feminist practices really, I view as a forward-thinking and visionary way to look at this. And so we're just really honored to have Neysa here tonight. So I'll pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimmy. Thank you for that introduction. Can you all hear me okay if I speak at this volume? Great, okay, so I'll leave that over there. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank Amy, and I want to thank Charlotte Street for hosting this conversation tonight. This is my first in-person Monuments to Movements conversation. So I like the fact that I don't have to worry about if I'm on mute. This is very refreshing, or if I'm disconnected, you know, you'll tell me if I'm disconnected. I also wanted to acknowledge something you just said, and that you said to me when we were touring the exhibition, that, you know, the show that Kimmy has curated with Liberty and Justice, if you haven't seen it yet, it's really powerful, really stunning work, I think brilliantly curated. It's also can be a little heavy, maybe painful to read these stories that the artists are uncovering and that they're working through, and I think you know, moving through it, there can be feelings of hopelessness, like this stuff just happens over and over, and we're experiencing trauma every day that we're reading about in the world. And something Kimmy said was that, you know, she saw this project that I'm working on as something hopeful. And thinking about, you know, what do we do with these frustrations or pain or anger that we're dealing with? How do we funnel that into something that creates more equity and equality? And so I just want to say that was a really wonderful comment and a compliment that you paid to me. And I hope that, you know, some of that comes across. So this project is called Monuments to Movements in the House of Radical Feminist Practices. And I've been working on it for about 1 year with a collaborator of mine named Jane Sachs, who I've been working with for many years on both gallery projects and public art projects that are at the intersection of feminism and social justice. So about a year ago, I got this call from her, which, you know, changed the trajectory of my work, when she said, I'm working with a foundation and they want to hear a pitch for a new initiative around monuments. And so, you know, together we just got to kind of think of our dream project. And we knew that we wanted to re-envision, reimagine what monuments could look like. And we knew it had to be feminism, because if it wasn't wrapped up in intersectional feminism, it wasn't worth it for either one of us. And so the past year, we basically had a grant for research and development. And we've done workshops and conversations and built a think tank and brought in all kinds of collaborators, and also envisioned what our inaugural projects would be. And I'm going to talk about a lot of that tonight, of kind of the process of building this, and then we'll end with the 4 projects that we're launching with. So just a couple weeks ago, we publicly launched, and so we put our website up and we put a newsletter out, and we said, you know, here we are, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to make a lot of trouble, and we hope that you're with us. So I'm going to start with this. Do you all recognize this? So, can you raise your hand if you recognize it? Has anybody seen it? Okay, so this is in Kansas City. This was summer of 2020. So it doesn't look like that now, but let me just play this video. It's only 8 seconds. But This is what the Andrew Jackson Monument looked like at City Hall in June and July 2020 during the protests and the Black Lives Matter actions here in Kansas City. And so Andrew Jackson has been a contested monument and statue in Kansas City for some time. And as reckonings have happened around the country and around the world, Kansas City's been at a bit of a standstill in what to do with this. And so during the summer of 2020, lots of activists decided to make their views known, and I think really improved the appearance of it with street art and messaging. And so the city put this tarp over it, and made it look kind of like this cloaked demon. And the reason I like to show the video is so you can see like this cloak kind of moving. It's so ominous. And I also like to think of it as kind of a symbol of how we have dealt with really problematic symbols in our public spaces for a long time. We throw a cloak over white supremacy, we sweep patriarchy under the rug, and all the other things that represent intolerance and exclusivity and hatred in our public spaces. Oftentimes we don't know what to do with them. And so now if you go to City Hall, you'll see this statue has been restored. Andrew Jackson is back in all of his cleaned up glory. And at least half of Kansas City citizens are pretty upset about that. And so, one of the reasons is that statues like this don't necessarily represent the full history of a community. Andrew Jackson, yes, a president of the United States, also enslaved hundreds of people, was an advocate of the Indian Removal Act. So we're talking about enslavement, death, trauma caused to hundreds of thousands of people. And so in light of that, thinking about where we can come from there, we don't want to stop on that note. We're not, just because that's still standing in stone doesn't mean we have to accept it. There's a lot we can do. So as we were thinking about what this project would be, here's some questions that helped our thinking. What if our monuments honored collective action? That means what people do together, instead of a solitary figure or a so-called hero that gets to tell the story for everybody. Why should public art be designed using radical feminist practices? And I'm gonna break that down a little bit as we go on. What a feminist practice in creating a monument looks like. And that ties right into inclusive and equitable participation. So feminist practice and inclusive participation are different things, but they're really kind of hand in hand, because feminism grew out of a desire to be inclusive and to have more equity between everybody. So we started these online workshops where we had a facilitator named Jess Solomon from a group called Art and Praxis in Baltimore. And with Jess, we invited people from really all over the world, literally. There were people dialing in from Vancouver to Johannesburg. And here's some of their first names. You can read all about them on our website. You can see their pictures, their work, their bios. Here's their first names. So when they all came together, the first thing we would do in these workshops, and the workshops were really intended to explore those 3 questions that I just had up. So we go around and everybody would talk about what deeper story might they tell about their community through a monument. And we defined a community by tradition, place, spirit, identity, geography, or history. We really wanted people to think expansively about both what a community means and both, what your story comes from. And if your story and your community is worth being in public space as much as anybody else sitting on a horse in any public space. And of course we think yes. So everybody got to go around the circle and tell something about themselves. And their monument ideas were like everything from a monument to invisible laborers, the people that maintain our spaces or take care of our children and are usually vulnerable, have less rights, and are lesser seen and appreciated. Somebody else suggested a monument to all of the aunties on her block that raised each other's children, and that there should be a monument to that kind of, co-child rearing in the community beyond, familial relations. And so, part of this was us kind of testing our idea, and part of it was also we're doing this to build this movement so that people can see themselves and their stories, which may be really undertold, in a public setting and being worthy of taking up public space. So we also defined with our groups what a monument was and what a movement was. And I'm sure a lot of you have done these jam boards before, and so everybody could get in on the same time, type something into a virtual sticky and put it up there. And we told them a little bit about how we were defining these things. And you can go on our website, monumentsmovements.org, and see our description of what a monument is and what a movement is. I have to be honest though, we've designed it to evolve. So as we're working with people, as we're learning things, we're changing our definition. And we believe that's how it should be, that these things, these ideas and these definitions should never be set in stone, that we should keep learning and updating these things. So we said, to us, a monument should not be to one individual. And part of the reason for that is that, or I should say, hard for me to think of a really successful social movement that was done by one person. Most of the time, it's many people working together over a long period of time, changing tactics, taking a few steps forward, a few steps back. And if we start to think every movement is one person, you take that away and kind of the story's lost. But in reality, if you take away the hero, you have all the workers, you have the foot soldiers, you have all those accomplishments and all those individual stories that go into the idea of commemorating collective action. One thing we do think about monuments is that they should be in public space, and public art and public space means free and accessible to everybody. So instead of like, yes, we'll tell your story, but it's going to be over here, and there's less access, we believe these things should be in public space. So with a movement, our kind of starter definition was kind of like what I just said. It's a progress, usually a social justice progress initiative that does originate with a group of people and can change directions depending on the course that it's taking or the generation that has taken it over. I mean, when you think about women's right to vote, suffrage, this was hundreds of years. And lots of different people took lead at one time or another, and there was lots of different ideas at play. Excuse me. And so those are kind of like our starter points for these things, and then people would kind of throw up the things that were resonating with them. So, a monument, a public art piece that pays tribute to history, a way to honor leaders or movements, a movement, by us, for us, I love that one, fights the status quo, evolves. The kind of thinking about how these two things, the monument and the movement, play off of each other. So at the end of that period of these workshops, we came up with what are kind of our 4 defining pillars for monuments to movements. So monuments without heroes, no more heroes. We're commemorating collective action. Feminist tools of practice. So for us, the feminist tools of practice mean kind of breaking down power structures that all of us can be vulnerable to, power structures that rule our lives or that we have to compromise with to fit into these structures. So doing your best to dismantle the power structures. Shared authorship. So lots of times a big group will work on something, like a huge public art project. There's usually, dozens, if not hundreds of people working on a public art project. Oftentimes it's attributed to one person. And so really thinking about how do we share credit, how do we share authorship, and how do we also not just say other people were involved, but honor what they did and honor their contributions of how they could have altered the whole project. And part of feminism is making sure that the right people are at the table. So with lots of public art projects and monuments, it's very centralized power, oftentimes coming from a civic body, like a mayor's office or a state office, and that's where the money is, that's where the decision making is. And so it's really kind of stepping back a little bit. Like, yes, you can have a civic project, you can have a public-private project, and that can be very successful, but you have to be thinking about who's missing. You know, who should be part of this? Whose voice is missing? Whose story is missing? Who's being excluded? And make sure that they're being included. The last pillar is embracing impermanence in public spaces. So, you know, kind of like reconsidering the idea that every monument needs to be there forever. You know, does it? Do we need every statue or even every, you know, beautiful object that everybody loves and no one finds offensive? You know, should it be there forever? And does it even need to be an object? You know, can a monument be a performance? Can a monument be a poem? Can a monument be a play, a song? And could a monument be, you know, a temporary exhibition or something, a temporary work that's up for a month or so? And, you know, sometimes yes, you want something up for 20 years, you know, or longer. Maybe there's something that really makes sense to have it there for a long time. But that's still impermanent. And so we have to kind of remove that notion from our minds when we're thinking about public art and monuments, that it needs to be there forever. Or else future generations will be like us, like stuck with Andrew Jackson, not knowing what to do about it. So I'm going to go through a couple of projects that have just inspired our work as we've been thinking about, you know, actions of the past few years. So, you know, kind of very beautifully, more people are calling this past Monday Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. And so, like, what you see here in the middle was a toppled Columbus statue in Detroit, and a group of women representing, between the four of them, several different indigenous groups, took this over and reclaimed it and made statements about, you know, taking the land back, rematriating the land, thinking about who was here before. A similar thing happened in Bristol, England. If you saw, you know, the Colston statue being dragged through the streets in Bristol and thrown into the river, that's where that was. And an artist saw this woman, whose name was Jen Reed, protesting that day as part of the Black Lives Matter movement in Bristol, and asked if he could do a sculpture of her and put her up there, and that temporarily replaced the Colston statue. And then there's this legacy over on your right. This was a protest in New Haven, Connecticut in 1968, where women from the women's liberation movement and people from the Black Panthers movement came together to protest a group of women Panthers who were put in jail for their work as Panthers in New Haven. And this person, who I don't know if she's been identified, but kind of did the same thing. Like, where's the power structure here? And how do I, you know, invert the meaning of it by getting up there myself and calling attention to our movement? So, kind of projects that have inspired us for radical feminist practices. How many of you participated in the Women's March? Or at least recognize what you're looking at here. This is you can see all of the pussy hats that were a separate but collaborative project with the Women's March that was in Washington, D.C. And right here in the middle is a Kenyan American artist named Wangechi Mutu, who did sculptures that are representing human and spiritual power of Black women in Africa, and set them into these alcoves in the Metropolitan Museum in New York that had never been activated in this way. And that museum is kind of known for holding up patriarchy and white supremacy, and they are oftentimes called out for that by, say, the Guerrilla Girls. If you know anything by the Guerrilla Girls, you know they have critiqued the Met and continue to have reason to critique the Met for 30 years. And so when Wangechi Mutu put in these figures here, it forever changed how people think about that facade and what is possible and who's in power and who should have power. On the right is one of my favorite monuments to think about as far as inspiring monuments to movements. This is an artist named Dragonfly. This performance was done in New York City on Election Day, and she called this an embodied monument. And so she did a performance as Ona Judge. Has anybody heard of Ona Judge? So if you look her up, you will just be so mad you never heard her story, because she's just like, you really kind of start thinking about her as the more important figure than to the people who enslaved her, who were George and Martha Washington. So she was enslaved by the first president of the United States, and she escaped, and she successfully escaped as a very young woman. She was in her early 20s, and she was never caught, and she outlived them, so she was able to one day come out publicly and talk about her journey and talk about how George Washington never gave up trying to catch her and would send catchers after her all the time. And she managed to keep her freedom. And her story is just so fierce and inspiring. And so Dragonfly went around New York City on Election Day to highlight places in New York where Ona Judge might have been, because the Washingtons did traffic her to New York and Philadelphia and back to Virginia. And so she goes around kind of like unfolding and introducing this story, and also highlighting places where other, historical moments, like where slave trading was happening, or other things to kind of help people understand, slavery was alive and well in New York. We think it was in the South, but it was through the North as well. And so she called this an embodied monument. I don't know if I already said that, but the idea that a monument and the story can take so many different forms. Obviously, it can be a performance, but as a performance, she can also continue to change the story. So she could then go to Philadelphia and do another performance about, where did Ona Judge live? Where did she escape? Where did people protect her? How did she get out? And so it can just be this kind of living, breathing thing. Inclusive participation. I picked a few projects that I thought could give you an idea about what can be accomplished through inclusive participation. So this is an image from Paris during climate talks in 2017, I think. And so there was going to be a climate march there, and there was a terrorist activity, and they canceled the march. And so all the people that were going to make an action about climate change put their shoes there, got other people to put their shoes there, and to just kind of reference what they were going to do, and also present this army of people who weren't backing down through these shoes. And I just kind of love that they solved that issue and how it became a monument in itself. This was an online project that the National Domestic Workers Association did to talk about how feminism has strengthened their position and helped them advocate in the world of domestic labor. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that group soon. Up top is the Wall of Women, which was in northern India in 2019. And this was, they estimate 4 million women stood shoulder to shoulder over hundreds of miles to protest inequality of women there, to raise awareness about gender violence. And it was like nothing they'd ever seen. And no one thought this many women would turn out, and it did affect change. In the bottom, the Black Lives Matter murals, I think this one's in DC, we've all seen them. Maybe some of you participated in them. In Kansas City, we had 6 Black Lives Matter street murals. It was the largest series in the country, and so we should feel really proud of that. This was, the Black Lives Matter movement and the resulting public art that represents the movement. This is everything from committed people working on this for years and years and years to other people just being introduced to the mission of Black Lives Matter and being introduced to the idea that it should be central to how we live our lives. And so we worked on one in Brookside, and there were lots of people just walking by, just kind of learning, what are you all doing? What is this about? Can I help? What can I do? And so this was, just the epitome of very successful inclusive participation. So I'm going to talk about how the process of inclusive participation can work. And this was a project I worked on in Philadelphia that is still ongoing. And it was kind of something that I didn't even know how it would work until I was in the thick of it. And now it's kind of how I want to do every single project I work on. So this house is called Stenton. It's in Philadelphia in the historic Germantown neighborhood, built in 1730. And up until recently, the mission was to interpret the white history, the landowners and what they did. And the first owner was James Logan, who was a pretty prominent figure in basically the development of Pennsylvania. He worked with William Penn and established government there, also had a hand in deceptive activities with indigenous people. And so a lot of that's coming out. And what the staff there has now decided to do is start interpreting the history of the enslaved people that lived there. And they're lucky in that they had at least one figure who was kind of famous in her time. Her name was Dinah, and these are her approximate birth and death dates. And she would live there her whole life from the time she was an adolescent until she died in her 70s. During the American Revolution, as the story goes, the British were going through Germantown, just burning homes down, and they came to this home, and we know she was there. We don't think the Logan family was there. And she answers the door, and the British say, "We've come to burn your house down." And she just kind of tricked them. She told them to go get some hay in the barn, and then she locked them in there to figure out probably what to do. And then some more British came by and said they were looking for deserters. And she said, "They're locked in my barn for you." And so they took them off, and then the house never got burned down. And so she became very famous in the community. And she also was able to negotiate her own manumission. So she went from an enslaved person to a paid laborer of the house. She was also able to bring over some family members to also come over and be paid staff for the first time. And through all of that, she decided to live her life out there. And so her story was kind of through the ages. It would be commemorated and then lost again, and then someone would find it again and lost again. And but the community that always revered her and never forgot about her was the primarily Black community that lives around Stenton. So almost the whole neighborhood is of African descent and goes back generations. And so the staff at Stenton engaged the community there. What do you know about Dinah? What did your grandparents tell you about Dinah? What did you learn in school about Dinah? And there were all different kinds of demographics engaged. So like the folks in this picture, they're like, this woman actually does performances at Dinah, and that man's on the board. And then you have other kind of neighbors here who might know something about the project but wanted to come learn about it. And then you have a school group over there. And they did a full year of these conversations with community members before ever thinking about, what will this monument to Dinah look like? And so they brought me on as a curator early on, and it was a very interesting process for me to not think about artists for a full year. I was like, who are we gonna get to do this? And what's this gonna look like? And then I'm continuing to learn through these conversations what people want, what people don't want. And the artist that ended up getting the project is this woman in the lower right, Karen Olivier, who happens to be from that area. And we actually, after I was able to garner from the community what they wanted, I brought in 3 different artists from around North America who presented their ideas, and the community decided they really liked Karen's project. And what they had told us was, we want it out in the garden, because we did know that Dinah tended to the garden. She probably actually designed the whole garden. We also know that she's buried somewhere on the property, although they don't know where she is yet. And they also said, we don't want it to look like her, because nobody actually knows what she looked like, so that would be dishonest. So let's not pretend and create some physical likeness. And they said, we want to feel like we can have a conversation with her. And so these are the different things that the artists were given to respond to. And so Karen did this kind of seating area made out of rose quartz stone. There's a fountain in the middle, and this is not built yet, obviously. You can probably tell it's a digital sketch. It's still in fabrication. And then she also kind of posed some questions that people could ask of themselves and ask of Dinah, because that was really something people expressed a lot, like we want to connect with her, and we want, through her and her story, we want this to be a launching point to continue to explore and learn about other people that may have lived in the area. Another goal of it is to see if they can find Dinah's descendants, of which so far they don't know of any. But they're hoping to learn more through that. So this project, yes, it just kind of changed the way I think about how projects should originate, and who's at the table, and what direction should it take, and what should it look like, what story should it tell. So now I'm going to move into our 4 inaugural projects for Monuments to Movements. So I was talking about the National Domestic Workers, and we've been talking to that group for a while, and as you may or may not be familiar with, and if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look up what's happening with domestic workers now in the federal infrastructure bills that are going through. So domestic workers have been written in, written out, now maybe getting written in again to be considered part of American infrastructure. So there's a movement completely, conceived of and pushed by the National Domestic Workers Association to prioritize people as infrastructure. Yes, roads and bridges are infrastructure, utilities are infrastructure, but what happens if you take away the people that care for us? The people that care for our most vulnerable, our children, the elderly, the sick. That's an infrastructure that should be invested in. And so this is very current right now, like it's being debated right now. And so we want to do a monument to human infrastructure, and of course who should be at the table? That should be the domestic workers themselves. And so on our think tank and in our workshops we had representatives from the National Domestic Workers. And as you can see from this image from another action, creative expression is not foreign to them. So a lot of what they do incorporates their own artistic talents as well as attention getters and as message spreaders and as inspirers. So for this project, we're really thinking of creating songs. So we want to work with people to gather their stories of their experience in domestic work, or if it's part of their lineage. A lot of people say, this is what my mother did and what my grandmother did, or the stories from the past. And so our monuments through them, at least right now, because anything can change, we're thinking of monuments of song. The next project is a monument to the people's next-gen democracy. So this couple over here, this is Vanessa September. She's an architect and urban designer and the CEO of Constitution Hill in South Africa. And her partner is Albie Sachs, who was invited by Nelson Mandela to co-author the Constitution when they first became a democracy. And he was one of the inaugural judges on Constitutional Court, which is like the Supreme Court. And so what you see there is Constitution Hill, a former site of torture and suppression of political adversaries in South Africa during apartheid, and now it's a living museum to continue telling the story of democracy in South Africa. It's also where the Constitutional Court is. And so we have collaborated with them before, and they're on our think tank for Monuments to Movements. And through conversations with them, we started thinking about their democracy is very new, only a couple decades old. Ours is hundreds of years old, yet sadly, we have so much in common as how we all have to continue to fight for it. In January, we learned democracy could be under threat as laws passed to restrict people from voting. We continue to learn our democracy is under threat. And so there's a lot we have in common with them, that the fight never ends. You can never take your democracy for granted. And so with them, we want to do kind of an exchange where we want to send artists from the United States to South Africa and vice versa, and to work with youth groups, because it is very much going to fall on the shoulders of our younger generations and how to preserve our democracy. And we see that now with who's out there protesting, who are the activists, it's the younger generation. Not entirely, I know you all are out there too, and we're all different ages here. But we do see more and more young people getting very engaged in a way that maybe we didn't have to be engaged with preserving our democracy before. Some of us, yes, and at times, no. So we want this to be very youth-focused as well, and we want it to be a monument through the form of media. So it might be a video, it might be a film, something like that. And again, you know, these are all like our seeds we've planted, and so we don't know what form these things will take yet. We want the participants to have a strong role in what the monuments will actually look like. I think, okay, so this one's going to be local. You probably recognize the American Jazz Museum. So this project is called the Monument to Girls' Artistic Liberation. And so this is the result of a conversation I've been having with Rashida Phillips, the ED at the Jazz Museum. And we were talking a lot about, sorry, this bug loves me. So we were talking a lot about Black female musicians that have had a huge impact in Kansas City and that may be lesser known. Their stories are lesser known. And we're talking about Mary Lou Williams, like an incredibly influential pianist, organizer, music arranger, jazz musician, you know, all the way up through Janelle Monáe. We know her story's being told. She's a very prominent musician and performer. But kind of thinking somewhat about that trajectory and about how we can think about women and girls, primarily of African descent, being models of artistic liberation. And so we are going to start with workshops with girls, literally girls, like under 18. And it, you know, there's some parallels with the next generation, the next gen democracy, just kind of trying to give more voice and power and direction to younger population. And we'll start with workshops. And we'll just kind of introduce ideas. We're gonna start with Mary Lou Williams first, thinking about prompts from her songs and prompts from her life, how she really kind of rose to prominence in a very male-dominated space and had a long, prolific career. She was in Kansas City for about a decade, and then she moved on to New York, and she was in Europe, and really changed the trajectory of American jazz through very forward-thinking approaches. You know, where should we go next? What's possible? How can we expand this field? Finally, we're building an archive, and so a group we work with in the Twin Cities is called the Urban Art Mapping Group, and they have primarily done street art and street art to anti-racism. So if you go on their website, you'll see their biggest archive is the George Floyd anti-racism street art archive, and it's entirely crowdsourced. They have people, you know, submitting things from all over the world, and this image here is from George Floyd Square. And is in their archive, and they continue to document this because, again, it's kind of this living, breathing public work. And we approached them because we wanted to be able to show the movement building. And so, you know, as we create projects, as our partners create projects, and as we start to recognize other existing monuments to movements, that we can put them in an archive to show this expanded vision of how we can envision and create, represent our stories through public art. So that's going to be live by the end of the month. And if you have anything you want to submit, you can go onto our website and you'll be led there to put in your own project. So finishing up on get involved, because we want to grow the movement, so we're always recruiting. I grabbed this from our website, but so one way to get involved is again, to contribute to the archive. If you want to support our work, we have a lot of people kind of volunteering for us in different ways. You know, we just launched, so we're very much in the fundraising stage right now so that we can have staff and build these projects. But we have a lot of people that are just kind of helping build our movement through, you know, donating resources like designing our website, creating our amazing logo, doing social media. And one of the most important ways is connecting us to other people who can be mutually beneficial. How can we support their work? How can they support our work? And then you can connect to us. You can shoot us an email, follow us on Instagram. If you go on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. and that will keep you very, very informed, and especially on local things. As the local ones start to progress, there'll be opportunities to get involved really on the ground too if you want. And that is all. So thank you so much for the time.